You walk into meetings knowing you have valuable insights to share, but somehow the conversation moves on without you ever finding the right moment to speak. Every networking event leaves you feeling invisible, while others effortlessly command attention and build meaningful connections that advance their careers. I am Dale Carnegie, and I transformed from a shy farm boy who was terrified of public speaking into the man whose principles have helped millions master the art of human connection. What I discovered about conversation mastery will transform every interaction you have, giving you the confidence and skills to influence, inspire, and connect with anyone in any situation. The same principles that helped me overcome crippling shyness and build a communication empire can turn you into the kind of person others seek out and remember. But first, like this video, subscribe for more life-changing communication wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to master the art of conversation. Let me take you back to where this all began, to the rolling hills of Missouri where I grew up on my father's farm. Those mortgage papers that my father clutched with trembling hands every month told a story of struggle that I would carry with me for the rest of my life. We were poor, desperately poor, and I was painfully aware that our family's survival hung by the thinnest of threads. I was the boy who sat in the back of the one-room schoolhouse, burning with ideas but paralyzed by the thought of speaking them aloud. When the teacher called on me, my mouth would go dry, my palms would sweat, and whatever brilliant thought I'd had would evaporate like morning dew. The other children learned to expect nothing from Dale Carnegie but silence and psalmodion. At church socials and community gatherings, I would stand against the wall, watching other young people laugh and chat with an ease that seemed like magic to me. How did they do it? How did words just flow from their mouths without the crushing weight of self-consciousness that pressed down on my chest every time I tried to speak? My mother would watch me with concerned eyes. "Dale," she'd say gently, "you have such wonderful thoughts. If only you could share them with others." But I couldn't. The very idea of being the center of attention, even for a moment, filled me with such terror that I preferred invisibility to the risk of embarrassment. The worst part was knowing that my silence was costing our family. When traveling salesmen came to the farm, I watched my father struggle to negotiate, to advocate for fair prices, to build the relationships that could have meant the difference between keeping the farm and losing everything. I had ideas, insights, even at that young age, about how he could present our situation more effectively. But I was just the quiet boy in the corner, and quiet boys don't save farms. I remember the night I heard my parents talking in hushed, worried tones about the possibility of losing everything. My father's voice was heavy with defeat as he said, "I just don't know how to make them understand our situation." That's when I realized that communication wasn't just about social comfort, it was about survival itself. The humiliation reached its peak during my senior year when I was supposed to give a graduation speech. For weeks, I practiced in the barn, speaking to the cows and horses who couldn't judge me. But when the day came, I stood before that crowd of familiar faces and felt my throat close up completely. The words I had rehearsed 100 times simply wouldn't come. I stood there in agonizing silence until the principal finally gestured for me to sit down. But that moment of public failure, as crushing as it was, planted a seed of determination. Lying in bed that night, I made a promise to myself that would change everything. I would not let my fear of speaking condemn me to a life of invisibility and missed opportunities. I didn't know how yet, but I knew I had to find my voice, not just for myself, but for my family's future. That first sales commission check for $8.50 might as well have been $1 million to me. I held that piece of paper in my trembling hands and realized I had just discovered something that would change not only my life, but the lives of millions of others who would follow. When I took that job, selling correspondence courses to farmers, Across Nebraska and Wyoming, I was still the same tongue-tied boy from Missouri. But necessity has a way of forcing you past your limitations. I had to eat, and eating meant talking to strangers about their problems and convincing them that I had solutions. My first sales call was a disaster. I approached a weathered farmer in his barn, my carefully rehearsed pitch echoing hollowly in my head. But when I opened my mouth, nothing came out the way I had planned. Instead, something magical happened. I started asking him about his farm, his challenges, his dreams for his family. For the first time in my life, I wasn't focused on what I was going to say next. I was genuinely curious about another human being. That farmer talked for an hour about the struggles of modern agriculture, about wanting his sons to have opportunities he never had, about feeling left behind by a rapidly changing world. And as I listened, really listened, I began to understand that my correspondence courses weren't just about education. They were about hope, about possibility, about a father's love for his children. I didn't just make a sale that day, I made a connection. And that connection taught me the first fundamental principle of conversation mastery. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. But the real breakthrough came a few weeks later with a farmer named Henry Thompson. Henry was skeptical, rough around the edges, and had already turned away 3 other salesmen that month. When I knocked on his door, he greeted me with crossed arms and a scowl. "If you're here to sell me something, boy, you can save your breath." Instead of launching into my pitch, I noticed the beautiful horses in his pasture. "Those are magnificent animals," I said, and I meant it. I grew up on a farm too, and I've never seen such well-cared for horses. Henry's entire demeanor changed. His arms uncrossed, his shoulders relaxed. And suddenly he was telling me about his prize stallion, about his breeding program, about the horse that had saved his son's life during a blizzard. We talked for 2 hours about horses, farming, family, and dreams. The sale almost happened as an afterthought. As I walked away with another commission in my pocket, I realized I had stumbled onto something profound. When you show genuine interest in other people, when you make them feel important and valued, they naturally want to share their world with you. And when people feel truly heard and understood, trust follows naturally. This was my first glimpse into the psychology of human connection. I began to study every successful conversation I had, analyzing what worked and what didn't. I discovered that the farmers who bought from me weren't necessarily buying correspondence courses. They were buying the feeling of being understood, respected, and valued. But perhaps most importantly, I was discovering my own voice in the process. When I focused on others instead of my own fears, when I became genuinely curious about their lives and challenges, my natural enthusiasm and warmth began to emerge. I wasn't just learning to sell, I was learning to connect, one conversation at a time. When the YMCA director in New York asked me to teach a public speaking course, I almost laughed out loud. Here I was, still fighting my own demons with public speaking, and they wanted me to teach others. But as I looked at that enrollment sheet with the names of businessmen, professionals, and entrepreneurs who had signed up, I realized this might be the opportunity I had been unconsciously preparing for my entire life. The night before my first class, I couldn't sleep. I paced my small apartment, rehearsing what I would say, how I would introduce myself, how I would possibly convince a room full of successful adults that I had something valuable to teach them. The irony wasn't lost on me. The boy who had been too afraid to speak in his high school graduation was about to teach public speaking to New York businessmen. When I walked into that classroom for the first time, I saw my own fear reflected in every face. There was the banker who shifted nervously in his seat, the insurance salesman who kept checking his pocket watch, the shop owner who looked like he wanted to bolt for the door. These were successful people in their own fields, but when it came to expressing themselves with confidence and clarity, They were just as terrified as I had always been. That's when it hit me. I wasn't there to pretend I was perfect. I was there because I understood their struggle intimately. I knew what it felt like to have your heart pound so hard you were sure everyone could hear it. I knew the agony of having brilliant ideas trapped inside by fear and self-doubt. So instead of lecturing from a position of false authority, I shared my story. I told them about the graduation speech disaster, about standing paralyzed in front of my classmates, about the years of believing I had nothing valuable to contribute. And something magical happened. Every person in that room leaned forward. They weren't just listening. They were connecting with someone who truly understood their pain. The secret, I told them that first night, isn't to eliminate the fear. It's to speak despite the fear, to find something you care about more than your own comfort. I shared how I had discovered that when I focused on helping others, on serving their needs, my own fears seemed to diminish. But the real revelation came when I started having them practice. Instead of traditional speaking exercises, I had them share personal stories, talk about their businesses, their families, their passions. I watched transformation after transformation as these nervous adults discovered that they had been interesting, engaging speakers all along. They just needed permission to be themselves. Week after week, I saw the same pattern. When people stopped trying to be perfect and started trying to be helpful, when they stopped focusing on themselves and started focusing on their audience, their natural communication abilities emerged. The banker discovered he could captivate a room when talking about helping families achieve financial security. The shop owner found his voice when describing how he served his community. I was learning as much as I was teaching. Every class revealed new insights about human nature, about the psychology of communication, about what really moves people to listen, engage, and connect. I began to see patterns, the techniques that worked consistently, the approaches that failed predictably, the subtle shifts that turned ordinary conversations into extraordinary connections. The enrollment sheet that had once intimidated me became my laboratory. These weren't just students. They were collaborators in discovering the principles that would eventually help millions of people find their voices, build their confidence, and transform their relationships through the power of authentic communication. The letter from Henry Ford changed my understanding of human nature forever. Written in his own hand, it wasn't about business or automobiles. It was a thank you note for the genuine interest I had shown in his early experiments with affordable transportation. What struck me wasn't the letter itself, but what it represented. One of the most powerful men in America, taking time to acknowledge someone who had simply cared enough to listen. Most people approach conversations backwards. They walk into every interaction thinking about what they want to say, what impression they want to make, what they hope to gain. But I discovered something revolutionary during my early teaching days. The most magnetic people in any room are those who are genuinely fascinated by others. I learned this lesson in the most unexpected way. During one of my classes, a student named Robert was struggling terribly. He was an accountant, brilliant with numbers, but painfully awkward in conversation. Other students would politely listen to his practice speeches, but I could see their eyes glazing over. Robert was focused entirely on delivering his information correctly, with no awareness of how it was being received. After class one evening, I asked Robert about his weekend plans. His face lit up as he told me about his hobby. He collected rare butterflies. For 20 minutes, this man who had bored an entire room with his tax preparation speech held me absolutely spellbound as he described the intricate patterns on a monarch's wings, the migration mysteries of various species, the delicate process of preservation. "Robert," I said when he finished, "you just gave the most captivating speech I've ever heard from you. What was different?" He thought for a moment and said, "I suppose it was because you seemed genuinely interested in what I was saying." That moment crystallized everything for me. Robert hadn't suddenly become a better speaker, I had become a better listener. My genuine curiosity about his passion had unlocked his natural enthusiasm and expertise. He wasn't performing or trying to impress. He was sharing something he loved with someone who cared to understand it. I began experimenting with this principle everywhere. At business meetings, instead of planning my next comment, I would focus entirely on understanding what others were really saying, what they cared about, what kept them up at night. At dinner parties, instead of waiting for my turn to speak, I would ask questions that invited people to share their expertise, their experiences, their dreams. The results were astounding. People began seeking me out at events. Business relationships deepened. Strangers opened up to me with surprising honesty. I wasn't doing anything manipulative or calculating. I was simply giving people what they craved most, the experience of being truly seen and understood. But here's what I discovered that most people miss. You cannot fake genuine interest. People have an almost supernatural ability to detect when someone is merely going through the motions of caring. The interest must be authentic. An authentic interest comes from a fundamental shift in how you view other people. I learned to see every person I met as a fascinating book waiting to be read. The taxi driver who navigated the city's streets, what had he observed about human nature? The waitress balancing multiple tables, what had she learned about efficiency and grace under pressure? The executive in the expensive suit, what fears and hopes drove his ambitious climb? When you approach people with this kind of genuine curiosity, several magical things happen simultaneously. First, they feel valued and important, which makes them naturally more open and engaging. Second, you actually learn something valuable from every interaction, making you a more interesting and well-rounded person. Third, you stop being nervous about conversations because you're not focused on performing. You're focused on discovering. This principle became the cornerstone of everything I would later teach. Before you can influence anyone, before you can inspire or lead or sell, you must first master the art of being genuinely interested in their world. When people feel that you truly care about understanding them, they become infinitely more receptive to everything else you might want to share. The leather-bound journal I carried everywhere became my secret weapon in building relationships. In it, I recorded not just names, but the stories behind them. Why Margaret's parents chose that name, how James got his nickname, what Maria's name meant in her family's native language. What I discovered was that a person's name isn't just a label, it's the sweetest sound in any language to them. I learned this lesson through painful experience. Early in my teaching career, I met a prominent businessman at a networking event. We had a wonderful conversation about his innovative approaches to employee motivation. He gave me his card, shared valuable insights, and invited me to visit his factory. But when I saw him again 2 weeks later, I couldn't remember his name. The moment I had to introduce him to someone else, the warmth in his eyes turned to disappointment. Our promising relationship never recovered. That embarrassing moment taught me that forgetting someone's name is equivalent to telling them they're not important enough to remember. From that day forward, I developed a systematic approach to not just remembering names, but making people feel truly recognized and valued. When someone told me their name, I would immediately repeat it back. "It's wonderful to meet you, Patricia." Then I would use it naturally throughout our conversation. "Patricia, that's a fascinating perspective on employee training." Before we parted, I would use their name again. "Patricia, I've really enjoyed our conversation." But I went deeper than just repetition. I learned to ask about names themselves. "That's an interesting name. Is there a story behind it?" Or, "I don't think I've heard that name before. What's its origin?" People would light up as they shared how they were named after a beloved grandmother, or how their name meant strength in their native language, or how their parents chose it after a character in their favorite book. In my journal, I would record these stories alongside their names. Robert Patterson, named after his grandfather who built the first school in their town, passionate about education reform, has twin daughters, Emma and Sophie. When I encountered Robert weeks or months later, I could greet him by name and ask about his education initiatives or his daughters. The impact was immediate and profound. I discovered that most people are starved for this kind of recognition. In a world where we're often reduced to numbers, titles, or functions, being truly seen and remembered as an individual is a rare gift. When you demonstrate that someone matters enough to remember, you're not just recalling information, you're acknowledging their worth as a human being. The practice transformed my relationships exponentially. Business contacts became genuine. Connections, casual acquaintances evolved into trusted advisors. People began introducing me to their networks, not because of what I could do for them, but because of how I made them feel about themselves. But here's what I learned about the deeper psychology. When you use someone's name, you're doing more than being polite. You're activating something fundamental in their brain. Hearing their own name creates a neurological response that makes them more attentive, more engaged, more receptive to whatever follows. I began teaching this principle to my students with dramatic results. Salespeople saw their conversion rates improve dramatically. Managers noticed increased cooperation from their teams. Parents found their children more responsive. The simple act of using names with intention and respect was opening doors that had previously remained closed. However, I also learned the importance of authenticity in this practice. Names used mechanically or manipulatively create the opposite effect. People can sense when you're using their name as a technique rather than as genuine recognition. The key is to truly see each person as an individual worthy of being known and remembered. The compound effect of name mastery amazed me. People would remember conversations with me years later, not because of what I said, but because of how I made them feel recognized and important. They would tell others about the man who actually cared enough to remember their name and their story. My reputation for building relationships spread, creating opportunities I never could have imagined. This simple practice, truly seeing people, remembering their names, and making them feel valued, became the foundation for everything that followed in my career and teachings. My conversation notes from observing Theodore Roosevelt revealed something extraordinary. The president had an almost supernatural ability to make everyone in a room feel like the most important person present. But it wasn't because he was a brilliant speaker, it was because he was a masterful listener. He listened with his entire being, and that attention transformed every interaction. Most people, I discovered, listen to reply rather than to understand. They're so busy formulating their next comment, preparing their counterargument, or waiting for their turn to speak that they miss the deeper currents of what's actually being communicated. This is why so many conversations feel hollow and unfulfilling. People are talking past each other rather than connecting with each other. I learned to recognize 3 distinct levels of listening, each more powerful than the last. The first level is mechanical listening, hearing the words without absorbing their meaning or emotional content. Most people operate at this level most of the time. They nod at appropriate moments and respond with generic phrases, but they're not truly present. The second level is focused listening, actually paying attention to the content and meaning of what someone is saying. This is where real communication begins. You're tracking not just the words, but the ideas, the logic, the information being shared. Most good conversations happen at this level, but the third level is transformational listening, tuning into not just what someone is saying, but how they're feeling, what they're not saying, what matters most to them beneath the surface of their words. This is where magical connections happen, where people feel truly understood, where relationships deepen and trust is built. I learned to listen with my eyes as well as my ears. Body language often revealed more than words. A slight tension in someone's shoulders might indicate stress they weren't verbally expressing. A momentary pause before answering could signal uncertainty or conflict. The way someone's energy shifted when discussing different topics showed me what they were truly passionate about versus what they felt obligated to discuss. During my teaching sessions, I would practice what I called strategic silence. Instead of rushing to fill every pause in conversation, I learned to be comfortable with moments of quiet that allowed people to go deeper, to share what was really on their hearts. Some of the most profound insights emerged, not from my questions, but from the space I created for people to think and feel and express themselves more fully. I discovered that most people are desperate to be truly heard. In a world full of noise and distraction, the gift of complete attention is revolutionary. When someone feels genuinely listened to, several things happen. They trust you more. They share more openly. They become more receptive to your ideas. And they leave the conversation feeling energized and valued. But here's what surprised me most. When I became a better listener, I became a better speaker. By truly understanding what mattered to people, I could frame my own thoughts in ways that resonated with their interests and concerns. I wasn't just broadcasting my ideas into the void, I was connecting my message to their world. I learned to listen for emotional undertones that revealed what people really cared about. A businessman discussing quarterly profits might sound purely analytical, but if I listened carefully, I could hear the pride in his voice when he talked about providing jobs for his community, or the worry beneath his optimism about market conditions. The practice of deep listening also taught me patience. I learned that people often need to talk through their surface thoughts before they get to what's really important to them. The executive who spent 10 minutes complaining about market conditions might, if given space and attention, reveal his deeper concerns about providing for his family's future or his dreams of expanding into new territories. This level of listening requires genuine humility. You have to be more interested in understanding others than in being understood yourself. You have to care more about their story than about telling your own. But when you master this skill, you discover that people will tell you their dreams, their fears, their hopes, and their struggles. They'll share insights that can transform your understanding of business, relationships, and life itself. My interview notes with Dale Carnegie revealed something that changed my entire approach to conversation. The steel magnate's success wasn't built on having all the answers, but on asking the right questions. The questions that unlocked his empire weren't about steel or business, they were about people, their dreams, their capabilities, their untapped potential. When Carnegie told me, "I want to surround myself with people who know more than I do about their areas of expertise," I realized he had discovered something profound about human nature. People have an almost irresistible urge to share their knowledge and experience with someone who is genuinely curious about what they know. But there's a world of difference between interrogation and genuine inquiry. I learned this lesson the hard way during my early sales days. I had prepared a list of questions designed to lead prospects toward purchasing my correspondence courses. The questions were logical, well-structured, and completely ineffective. People felt manipulated rather than understood, pushed rather than invited to share. The breakthrough came when I stopped asking questions to get somewhere and started asking questions to understand someone. Instead of what educational background do you think would help your son succeed, I learned to ask, what dreams do you have for your children's future? The difference was subtle but revolutionary. One question sought to identify a problem I could solve. The other invited a father to share his deepest hopes. I discovered that people love to answer questions about their expertise, their experiences, and their passions. A banker becomes animated when asked about the most interesting financial challenge he's ever solved. A teacher lights up when questioned about the student who taught her the most. A parent glows when invited to share what they're most proud of about their children. The key was learning to ask questions that people genuinely enjoyed answering. These weren't questions designed to trap or manipulate, but invitations to share what mattered most to them. What's the most rewarding part of your work? What's the biggest change you've seen in your industry? What advice would you give to someone just starting in your field? I developed what I came to think of as my treasure hunting approach to questioning. Every person I met was like a mine full of valuable insights, experiences, and wisdom. My questions were the tools that helped uncover these hidden treasures, not for my benefit alone, but for the joy of helping people articulate and share what they knew. The psychology behind effective questioning fascinated me. Open-ended questions that began with what, how, or why created space for people to expand, to explore, to share stories rather than just facts. How did you first get interested in that? Invited a narrative. What surprised you most about that experience? Encouraged reflection. Why do you think that approach worked so well? Prompted analysis and insight. But I also learned the power of follow-up questions that showed I was truly listening. That's fascinating. Can you tell me more about how you developed that strategy? Or I'm curious about what you learned from that setback. These weren't random questions. They built on what people had already shared, demonstrating that their words mattered enough to explore further. The compound effect of masterful questioning transformed my relationships. Business contacts began sharing their challenges and opportunities. With remarkable openness, colleagues trusted me with their concerns and aspirations. Students felt safe exploring their fears and dreams in my classes. I discovered that the right questions could turn strangers into allies in a single conversation. When someone feels truly curious about their thoughts and experiences, they naturally begin to see you as someone who values their perspective. This creates a foundation of respect and trust that makes all future communication more effective. However, I learned that timing and intuition were crucial. The best questions emerged from genuine curiosity about what someone had just shared, not from a predetermined list. When a farmer mentioned his concern about changing weather patterns, the natural follow-up wasn't about my correspondence courses. It was about how these changes were affecting his planning and what innovations he was considering. The ultimate goal wasn't to gather information for my own purposes, but to create conversations where people felt valued, heard, and appreciated for their unique knowledge and experience. When you master this approach, people don't just answer your questions, they begin asking for your thoughts, seeking your advice, and inviting you deeper into their world. The mirror on my office wall became my most important teacher, reflecting back truths about human connection that I had never understood before. Every morning, I would practice not just what I was going to say, but how I was going to be, and I discovered that a genuine smile was worth more than 1,000 perfectly chosen words. I learned this lesson through a painful realization about my own impact on others. During my early teaching days, I was so focused on delivering valuable content that I forgot to consider the energy I was bringing into the room. Students would arrive enthusiastic but leave feeling drained, despite learning useful techniques. It wasn't until one brave student told me, "Professor Carnegie, you seem to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders," that I understood what was happening. My seriousness, my intense focus on helping people, my determination to solve their problems, all of it was creating an atmosphere of heaviness rather than hope. People could sense my tension, my worry about their success, my frustration when they struggled. Without realizing it, I was projecting my own anxieties onto every interaction. That's when I began studying the power of authentic positive energy, starting with the simple act of smiling. But I quickly learned that there's a world of difference between a social smile and a genuine expression of warmth. Social smiles are performed for politeness. Genuine smiles emerge from actual positive feelings about the person or situation you're encountering. The breakthrough came when I shifted my internal focus. Instead of walking into conversations worried about outcomes or concerned about impressions, I began looking for something authentic to appreciate about each person I met. Maybe it was their willingness to learn, their dedication to their family, their perseverance through challenges, or simply their courage in showing up to improve themselves. When I found something genuine to appreciate, my smile became real. And real smiles have a neurological impact that fake smiles cannot achieve. They create what scientists would later call emotional contagion, the unconscious tendency for people to mirror the emotions they observe in others. When you're genuinely pleased to see someone, they begin to feel pleased too. I discovered that my energy set the tone for every interaction. If I walked into a room feeling burdened by problems, people would unconsciously absorb that heaviness. But when I entered with genuine enthusiasm for the possibilities we were about to explore together, that excitement became contagious. The mirror taught me to recognize the difference between how I thought I appeared and how I actually looked to others. I practiced finding authentic reasons to smile, even in challenging situations. When facing a difficult student, instead of focusing on their resistance, I learned to focus on their potential. When dealing with criticism, instead of feeling defensive, I could smile at the opportunity to learn something valuable. But here's what surprised me most. The practice of looking for reasons to smile authentically made me a happier person. When you train yourself to notice what's good, interesting, or hopeful about every situation, you literally rewire your brain to see more positivity in the world. I began teaching this principle to my students with remarkable results. Salespeople found that customers became more receptive when approached with genuine warmth rather than aggressive enthusiasm. Managers discovered that their teams responded better to challenges, presented with optimistic energy rather than grim determination. However, I learned that authenticity was crucial. People have an almost supernatural ability to detect fake smiles, forced enthusiasm, or manipulative warmth. The energy had to be genuine, which meant finding real reasons to feel positive about each interaction. The compound effect of this practice was extraordinary. People began seeking me out at events, not because I was the most knowledgeable person in the room, but because conversations with me left them feeling energized and hopeful. They associated me with positive feelings, which made them more open to my ideas and more likely to trust my advice. Your energy, I learned, is your first and most important communication. Before you say a word, people are already responding to the emotional atmosphere you create. Master this fundamental principle, and every other conversation skill becomes more effective. The debate club disaster certificate hanging in my office served as a daily reminder of one of the most important lessons I ever learned. You can win an argument and lose a relationship, but you cannot build a relationship by winning arguments. That certificate represented the night I demolished my opponent's position so thoroughly that I lost not only his friendship, but the respect of everyone who witnessed my victory. I was young, sharp-witted, and convinced that intellectual superiority was the key to influence. When my friend John presented what I saw as a flawed argument about business ethics, I systematically destroyed every point he made. I cited statistics, quoted authorities, and used logic like a surgeon's scalpel. By the end of the evening, John sat silent and defeated while I basked in the glory of being right. But my victory was hollow. John never spoke to me the same way again. The other club members, rather than admiring my debating skills, seemed uncomfortable in my presence. I had won the argument, but I had lost something far more valuable, the trust and goodwill of people I cared about. That painful experience taught me that when you make someone feel stupid, inferior, or defeated, you create an enemy rather than an ally. People's emotional reaction to being proven wrong often overrides any logical benefit they might gain from learning the truth. They remember how you made them feel long after they've forgotten what you said. I began studying how to handle disagreements in ways that preserved and even strengthened relationships. The key insight was recognizing that most disagreements aren't really about facts, they're about feelings, values, and personal identity. When someone argues passionately for a position, they're often defending more than just an idea. They're defending their competence, their wisdom, their worth as a thinking person. The breakthrough came when I learned to separate the person from the position. Instead of attacking someone's ideas directly, I learned to explore them with genuine curiosity. That's an interesting perspective, John. Help me understand how you arrived at that conclusion. This approach accomplished something remarkably, allowed people to explain their thinking without feeling attacked, and it often led them to discover weaknesses in their own position without me having to point them out. I developed what I came to call the bridge-building approach to disagreement. Instead of starting with "you're wrong because ... I learned to begin with "I see your point, and I wonder if we might also consider ... This acknowledges their perspective before introducing alternative viewpoints, making them far more receptive. Two different ideas. The power of admitting uncertainty became one of my strongest tools. Phrases like, "I could be wrong, but ... or "in my experience, I've found ... double quotes, created space for dialogue rather than debate. When you present your views as personal experience rather than universal truth, people feel safer exploring different perspectives. I learned to look for common ground before addressing differences. We both want what's best for the company, or I can see we share the same concern for quality. Established a foundation of shared values that made disagreements feel less threatening. When people feel that you're on the same team, they're more willing to explore different strategies for achieving common goals. Perhaps most importantly, I learned the power of asking questions rather than making statements when I disagreed with someone. What do you think might happen if we tried that approach? Or have you considered how this might affect our customers? These questions allowed people to think through the implications of their positions without feeling attacked or defensive. The practice of graceful disagreement transformed my relationships and my influence. People began seeking my opinion precisely because they knew I wouldn't make them feel foolish for thinking differently. Business negotiations became collaborative problem-solving sessions rather than adversarial contests. My students felt safe exploring controversial topics because they trusted I would respect their perspectives even when I disagreed. But here's what I discovered about the deeper psychology. When you disagree respectfully and thoughtfully, you actually increase your credibility rather than diminishing it. People trust the judgment of someone who considers multiple perspectives more than they trust someone who seems to have all the answers. The goal wasn't to avoid all disagreement, but to disagree in ways that deepened understanding and strengthened relationships. When you master this skill, conflicts become opportunities for connection rather than threats to be defended against. The thank you letter from my student, Margaret, changed my understanding of human motivation forever. She wrote that our conversation about her teaching methods had given her the confidence to implement an innovative reading program that transformed her entire classroom. But what struck me wasn't just her success, was her words. "You made me feel like my ideas mattered, like I had something valuable to contribute." That letter revealed something profound about human nature. Everyone has an invisible sign around their neck that reads, "Make me feel important." Most people go through their days feeling unnoticed, unappreciated, and undervalued. They accomplish tasks, solve problems, and contribute to their families and communities. But rarely does anyone acknowledge the significance of their efforts. I learned this lesson through observing the transformation that occurred when I began genuinely recognizing people's contributions. During my teaching sessions, instead of focusing only on what students needed to improve, I started highlighting what they were already doing well. "Robert, your analysis of market trends showed real insight," or "Sarah, the way you handled that difficult question demonstrated remarkable poise." The impact was immediate and dramatic. Students who had seemed disengaged suddenly became active. Participants, people who had appeared confident, revealed hidden insecurities that dissolved under genuine appreciation. But most importantly, I discovered that recognition wasn't just making people feel better, was making them perform better. The psychology behind this was fascinating. When people feel valued and appreciated, they naturally want to live up to that positive perception. Recognition doesn't just acknowledge past behavior, it encourages future excellence. When you tell someone they're thoughtful, they become more thoughtful. When you recognize their leadership, they step up as leaders. But I learned there's a crucial difference between flattery and genuine appreciation. Flattery is saying nice things about people to get something from them. Genuine appreciation is recognizing something authentic about their character, abilities, or contributions because you truly value those qualities. The key was developing what I called appreciation vision, the ability to see and acknowledge the good in everyone. This required shifting my focus from what people lacked to what they possessed, from their weaknesses to their strengths, from their failures to their efforts. I began studying people like a detective, searching for clues about their unique value. The quiet accountant, who never spoke up in meetings, turned out to have remarkable analytical skills that helped prevent costly mistakes. The receptionist, who seemed to just answer phones, was actually the social glue that held the entire office together. The struggling salesman had a gift for making customers feel comfortable and understood, even if his closing techniques needed work. The practice of sincere appreciation became a daily discipline. I looked for opportunities to acknowledge people's efforts, celebrate their successes, and recognize their potential. But the appreciation had to be specific and genuine. Instead of generic praise like "good job," I learned to say things like, "Your patience with that difficult customer really showed your professionalism and dedication to service." I discovered that people remember appreciation far longer than they remember criticism. Years later, former students would approach me not to thank me for correcting their mistakes, but to tell me how a single moment of recognition had changed their self-perception and motivated them to achieve things they never thought possible. However, I learned that timing and context mattered enormously. Public recognition had different power than private appreciation. Some people thrived on being acknowledged in front of their peers, while others preferred quiet, personal recognition. Understanding each person's preferences made the appreciation even more meaningful. The compound effect of this practice was extraordinary. People began going out of their way to help me, not because they owed me anything, but because they enjoyed being around someone who made them feel valued. My reputation for recognizing talent led to opportunities to work with remarkable people who might never have given me a chance otherwise. But perhaps the most important discovery was that the practice of looking for good in others made me a better person. When you train yourself to notice people's strengths, contributions, and potential, you develop a more positive view of humanity in general. You become the kind of person others want to be around, not because of what you can do for them, but because of how you make them feel about themselves. The hunger for recognition and appreciation is universal and never-ending. When you learn to feed this hunger authentically and consistently, you tap into one of the most powerful forces for building relationships and influencing positive change in the world. The notebook, where I collected personal stories, became my most powerful teaching tool, more effective than any textbook or theoretical framework I ever used. I learned that facts tell, but stories sell not just products or ideas, but understanding, connection, and transformation. When I told my students, about the farmer who taught me the value of genuine interest. They didn't just understand the concept, they felt its power. My discovery of storytelling's impact came through a frustrating realization. I could explain communication principles with perfect clarity, cite research, provide logical arguments, and still watch my students' eyes glaze over. But the moment I shared a personal experience that illustrated the same principle, the entire room would lean forward with engaged attention. The breakthrough story was about my early sales disaster with a gruff rancher named Tom Williams. I had approached Tom with my standard pitch about correspondence courses, armed with statistics about education and success. He listened politely for about 30 seconds before cutting me off. "Son, I've got cattle to tend to. Either you're here to help me with my problems, or you're here to create new ones." When I told this story to my students, something magical happened. They didn't just hear about the importance of focusing on others' needs, they experienced it through my embarrassment, my realization, and ultimately my success. When I started asking Tom about his challenges, instead of promoting my solutions, the story made the principle unforgettable because they lived it. Vicariously through my experience, I began systematically collecting experiences that could illustrate various communication principles. Each story had to meet specific criteria. It had to be true, relatable, and emotionally engaging. But most importantly, it had to contain a clear lesson that emerged naturally from the narrative, rather than being forced onto it. The structure of effective stories became apparent through practice. Every powerful story needed a character people could relate to, a challenge or conflict that created tension, and a resolution that revealed the principle being taught. But the best stories also included emotional elements: surprise, humor, disappointment, triumph that made the lesson stick in memory. I discovered that personal vulnerability made stories exponentially more powerful. When I shared my failures, embarrassments, and learning moments, people didn't think less of me, they trusted me more. My story about freezing up during my graduation speech resonated far more deeply than any theoretical discussion about overcoming fear could have achieved. The timing of stories became an art form. A well-placed anecdote could illustrate a point, break tension, regain attention, or transition between topics. But stories used poorly could derail conversations, confuse rather than clarify, or make the storyteller appear self-centered rather than helpful. I learned to adapt stories to different audiences while maintaining their essential truth. The same experience could be told with different emphasis, depending on whether I was speaking to salespeople, managers, teachers, or parents. The core lesson remained consistent, but the details and application shifted to match the listeners' interests and challenges. But perhaps most importantly, I discovered that encouraging others to share their stories was even more powerful than telling my own. When I asked, "Has anyone here had an experience that relates to what we're discussing?" the entire dynamic of the room changed. People became active participants rather than passive recipients, and their stories often illustrated principles more effectively than mine could. The practice of collecting and sharing stories transformed my teaching and my relationships. Complex ideas became simple when wrapped in narrative. Abstract principles became concrete when illustrated through experience. Skeptical audiences became engaged when they could see themselves in the stories being shared. I learned that humans are fundamentally storytelling creatures. We make sense of the world through narrative, remember information better when it's embedded in stories, and connect with others through shared experiences. When you master the art of storytelling in conversation, you're not just sharing information, creating experiences that change how people think and feel. The most powerful stories weren't always the most dramatic ones. Sometimes a simple moment of human connection, a small act of kindness, or a quiet realization could illustrate profound truths about communication and relationships. The key was recognizing which experiences contained universal lessons and learning, to share them in ways that honored both the truth of what happened and the needs of those listening. My observation journal from corporate training sessions revealed patterns of human behavior that transformed my understanding of communication. While everyone else focused on what people were saying, I began studying what they weren't saying, the subtle signals, energy shifts, and unspoken dynamics that determined whether conversations succeeded or failed. The revelation came during a particularly challenging training session with a group of executives. On the surface, they appeared engaged, asking questions, taking notes, participating in exercises, but something felt off. There was a tension in the room that I couldn't quite identify until I started paying attention to the silent conversations happening beneath the spoken ones. I noticed that certain individuals would glance at each other when specific topics arose, communicating volumes with just a look. Body language shifted when we discussed particular strategies. Some people leaned in with interest, while others subtly pulled back. The energy in the room would change dramatically depending on who was speaking, even when the content remained similar. That's when I began developing what I called emotional intelligence in real time, the ability to read and respond to the unspoken dynamics of any interaction. This skill became essential for anyone who wanted to master conversation because it allowed you to adapt your approach based on what was actually happening rather than what you hoped was happening. I learned to recognize the signs of genuine engagement versus polite attention. When people were truly interested, their entire body orientation shifted toward the speaker. Their questions became more specific and personal. Their responses built on what had been said, rather than introducing completely new topics. But when they were merely being polite, their body language remained neutral. Their questions stayed generic, and their energy felt flat. The practice of reading emotional temperature became crucial for timing interventions. I could sense when someone was ready to share something important versus when they needed more time to process. I learned to recognize the moment when someone shifted from defensive to open, from skeptical to curious, from resistant to receptive. Different personality types, I discovered, communicated their emotional states in distinctly different ways. Some people became more talkative when stressed, while others grew quiet. Some showed discomfort through increased movement and gesturing, while others became unnaturally still. Learning to recognize these individual patterns allowed me to respond more effectively to each person's actual needs. The subtle signs of agreement and disagreement fascinated me. True agreement involved more than just saying yes. It included matching energy levels, building on ideas, and asking questions that explored implementation. But polite disagreement, often masqueraded as agreement, revealed only through body language that didn't match the verbal responses. I began teaching my students to notice these patterns in their own conversations. When someone said they understood, but their facial expression showed confusion, that was valuable information. When a person claimed to be interested, but their energy remained low, that indicated a need to adjust the approach or explore what was really capturing their attention. The ability to sense what others needed from each conversation became perhaps the most valuable skill I developed. Some people needed to be heard and understood before they could focus on solutions. Others required logical analysis before they could embrace emotional appeals. Still others craved recognition and appreciation before they would consider new ideas. But reading the room wasn't just about observing others, required honest self-awareness about the energy and impact I was bringing to each interaction. I learned to monitor my own emotional state and adjust it when necessary. If I was feeling frustrated or impatient, that energy would inevitably affect others. Even if I thought I was hiding it well, the compound effect of emotional intelligence in conversation was extraordinary. Relationships deepened more quickly, because people felt truly understood rather than just heard. Conflicts resolved more easily because I could address the underlying emotional issues rather than just the surface disagreements. Opportunities emerged more naturally because I could sense when others were ready to explore new possibilities. This skill transformed every aspect of my communication, from one-on-one coaching sessions to large group presentations. When you can, read the subtle signals that indicate how people are really responding to your message. You can adapt in real time to ensure your communication lands with maximum impact and authenticity. The letters from students worldwide that filled my desk showed me something remarkable. The principles of genuine human connection transcend every boundary we think divides us. Whether the letter came from a factory worker in Detroit, a teacher in rural Alabama, or a businessman in London, the fundamental human needs remained the same: to be understood, valued, and respected. My first real test of cross-cultural communication came when I was asked to work with a group of international business leaders. I walked into that room with some trepidation, wondering how my Missouri farm boy background would translate to executives from Germany, Japan, Brazil, and India. What I discovered changed my entire perspective on human differences. On the surface, everything seemed different: language barriers, cultural norms, business practices, social expectations. But as I began applying the same principles I had learned in American boardrooms and classrooms, something universal emerged. The German executive who seemed stern and intimidating lit up when I asked about his family's engineering heritage. The Japanese businessman who appeared formal and distant became animated when discussing his philosophy of servant leadership. I learned that beneath every cultural difference lay the same fundamental human experiences. Everyone had struggled with self-doubt at some point. Everyone had dreams for their children's future. Everyone had faced failures that taught them valuable lessons. Everyone wanted to feel that their work mattered and their contributions were valued. The key to building bridges across differences was finding these universal threads while respecting the unique ways different cultures expressed them. In some cultures, respect was shown through formal address and careful protocol. In others, warmth and personal connection took precedence. But the underlying need for respect remained constant. I discovered that humility was my greatest asset when connecting across cultural divides. Instead of assuming I understood someone's background or perspective, I learned to ask questions with genuine curiosity. Help me understand how business relationships work in your culture, or what would be the most respectful way for me to address this topic? These questions demonstrated that I valued their expertise about their own experience. The practice of finding common ground became an art form when working with diverse groups. While specific experiences might differ dramatically, the emotions and lessons behind them were often remarkably similar. A farmer's story about persevering through drought could resonate deeply with an entrepreneur's tale of surviving business challenges. Even though the circumstances were completely different, I learned to listen for universal values that transcended cultural boundaries: hard work, family loyalty, personal integrity, the desire to contribute something meaningful to the world. When I could identify these shared values, conversations became bridges rather than barriers, connecting people across seemingly vast differences. But perhaps most importantly, I discovered that my own authenticity was the most powerful tool for crossing cultural divides. When I shared my own struggles, failures, and learning experiences honestly, people from every background could relate to the human emotions involved, even if the specific circumstances were foreign to them. The letters I received confirmed this principle repeatedly. A teacher in China wrote about using appreciation techniques with her students. A manager in Brazil described how listening skills had transformed his team dynamics. A parent in South Africa shared how asking better questions had deepened his relationship with his teenage daughter. Language barriers. I learned were often less significant than emotional barriers. When people felt genuinely respected and valued, they would work harder to communicate despite linguistic challenges. Conversely, perfect grammar couldn't overcome the feeling that someone considered themselves superior or dismissive. The practice of building bridges across differences enriched my own understanding immeasurably. Every culture I encountered taught me something new about human nature, communication, and relationship building. The formal politeness of some cultures taught me about respect. The expressive warmth of others showed me new ways to demonstrate care and concern. But the most profound lesson was that our differences, when approached with curiosity rather than judgment, become sources of strength rather than division. When you learn to see diversity as an opportunity to expand your understanding rather than an obstacle to overcome, every conversation becomes a chance to grow, learn, and connect more deeply with the magnificent complexity of human experience. My personal follow-up system using index cards became the foundation for maintaining thousands of meaningful relationships throughout my career. Each card contained not just contact information, but the essence of what made each person unique: their interests, challenges, dreams, and the specific ways I could add value to their lives. The importance of systematic follow-up became clear. Through a painful lesson early in my career, I had wonderful conversations with potential collaborators, made genuine connections with interesting people, and promised to stay in touch with dozens of individuals who could have become valuable relationships. But without a system, these promising beginnings withered away. Good intentions weren't enough. I needed disciplined action. The breakthrough came when I realized that most people's networking efforts died in the follow-up phase. They could meet people, have engaging conversations, and exchange contact information, but they failed to nurture these initial connections into lasting relationships. This gave me a tremendous advantage simply by following through consistently. I stood out from the crowd. My index card system was elegantly simple, but devastatingly effective. Each card captured the essential elements of a relationship: how we met, what we discussed, their current challenges and goals, their personal interests, and most importantly, specific ways I could help them. But the real power came from reviewing these cards regularly and taking action on the opportunities they revealed. I learned that effective follow-up wasn't about pushing my own agenda. It was about adding value to others' lives. When I read that John was struggling with employee motivation, I would send him an article about innovative leadership techniques. When Mary mentioned her daughter was applying to colleges, I would connect her with someone who had navigated that process successfully. The timing of follow-up became crucial. Reaching out too quickly could seem desperate or manipulative. Waiting too long meant the connection grew cold and the person forgot our initial conversation. I discovered that the sweet spot was usually 1 to 2 weeks after our first meeting, with subsequent contact points spaced based on the nature of our relationship and their preferences. But follow-up wasn't just about scheduled contact. It was about staying alert to opportunities to help. When I read a newspaper article that related to someone's business challenges, I would clip it and send it along. When I met someone who could benefit from knowing another person in my network, I would make the introduction. These unexpected touches often had more impact than formal follow-up messages. I developed different follow-up strategies for different types of relationships. Potential business partners needed regular but not overwhelming contact, focused on mutual opportunities. Mentoring relationships required more frequent check-ins about progress and challenges. Social connections thrived on personal touches related to their interests and family. The compound effect of consistent follow-up was extraordinary. People began thinking of me as someone who truly cared about their success, not just someone looking for opportunities to advance my own interests. They would reach out when they had problems I could help solve, opportunities I might find interesting, or simply when they needed someone who would listen and understand. I learned that follow-up was as much about quality as quantity. A brief, personalized note that showed I remembered our conversation and cared about their success was far more effective than a generic message sent to my entire contact list. People could tell the difference between authentic interest and mass communication. The system also helped me track the evolution of relationships over time. I could see patterns in what types of help people valued most, which topics generated the most engagement, and how our connections deepened through repeated, positive interactions. But perhaps most importantly, the practice of systematic follow-up changed how I approached every initial conversation. Knowing that I would be maintaining these relationships over time made me more intentional about understanding each person's real needs, interests, and goals. During our first meeting, the follow-up system transformed casual encounters into lasting relationships, single conversations into ongoing collaborations, and individual connections into a vast network of people who genuinely wanted to help each other succeed. When you master the art of nurturing relationships over time, you discover that the most valuable conversations happen not in that first meeting, but in all the interactions that follow. My mediation success records documented some of the most challenging conversations of my career, moments when relationships, careers, and even companies hung in the balance. These high-stakes situations taught me that difficult conversations aren't just harder versions of normal talks. They require completely different skills, mindset, and preparation. The first major conflict I helped resolve involved two business partners whose friendship and company were both on the verge of destruction. Years of accumulated resentments, misunderstandings, and hurt feelings had created such toxic communication that they could barely be in the same room together. Each conversation escalated into accusations and counter-accusations that pushed them further apart. What I learned from that experience fundamentally changed my approach to difficult conversations. The key wasn't to focus on resolving the surface issues, it was to address the underlying emotional wounds that were driving the conflict. Both partners felt unheard, unappreciated, and betrayed. Until those feelings were acknowledged and validated, no practical solutions would stick. The preparation for difficult conversations became as important as the conversations themselves. I learned to anticipate not just what I wanted to say, but how the other person might react emotionally. What were their likely fears, concerns, and defensive responses? What did they need to feel safe enough to engage authentically? How could I frame the conversation in terms of shared goals rather than competing interests? I developed what I called the emotional first aid approach to difficult discussions. Before addressing any practical issues, I would focus on understanding and acknowledging each person's emotional experience. It sounds like you've been feeling unheard, or I can see this situation has been really frustrating for you. This validation didn't mean agreement with their position, but it demonstrated respect for their feelings. The power of empathy in high-stakes conversations was remarkable. When people felt that their emotions were understood and respected, they became dramatically more receptive to exploring solutions. But empathy had to be genuine. People could instantly detect when someone was using understanding as a manipulation technique rather than expressing authentic care. I learned to deliver difficult messages in ways that preserve dignity while still communicating clearly. Instead of "you're wrong about this," I would say, "I see this differently, and here's why." Instead of "that won't work," I would offer, "I'm concerned about some potential challenges with that approach." The message remained clear, but the delivery reduced defensiveness. The technique of finding higher ground became crucial in resolving conflicts. When people were stuck arguing about specific tactics or approaches, I would redirect the conversation to shared values and common goals. "We both want this company to succeed," or "I know we both care about treating employees fairly." This reminded everyone that they were on the same team, even if they disagreed about strategy. But perhaps the most important skill was learning when to pause or postpone difficult conversations, when emotions were too high, when key information was missing, or when people weren't in the right mindset to engage constructively. Pushing forward often made things worse. Sometimes the most productive thing to say was, "I think we both need some time to process this before we continue." I discovered that apologizing effectively was an art form in difficult conversations. Genuine apologies focused on the other person's experience rather than your own intentions. "I'm sorry this situation has caused you so much stress" was more powerful than "I'm sorry if you misunderstood what I meant." The first showed empathy. The second deflected responsibility. The follow-up after difficult conversations often determined their ultimate success or failure. People needed time to process what had been discussed, and they needed reassurance that commitments made during emotional discussions would actually be honored. I learned to schedule specific follow-up meetings and to check in regularly about how agreements were working in practice. These challenging conversations taught me that conflict, when handled skillfully, could actually strengthen relationships rather than damage them. When people successfully navigated a difficult situation together, when they felt heard and respected even in disagreement, they often trusted each other more afterward than they had before the conflict arose. The skills required for difficult conversations, deep listening, genuine empathy, clear communication, emotional regulation, and creative problem-solving became the foundation for all my most important professional and personal relationships. When you can handle the hard conversations with grace and effectiveness, all your other communications become easier and more authentic. The testimonials from business leaders that accumulated over the years told a consistent story. Mastering conversation hadn't just improved their communication skills, it had accelerated their careers, expanded their opportunities, and transformed their entire professional trajectories. They had become the kind of people others actively sought out for advice, collaboration, and leadership. The transformation from ordinary communicator to conversation magnet didn't happen overnight, but the compound effects were extraordinary. When you consistently make people feel heard, valued, and understood, word spreads. Your reputation for building genuine connections begins to precede you, opening doors that would otherwise remain closed. I watched this phenomenon in my own career and in the lives of my most dedicated students. People who mastered these principles found themselves invited to important meetings, included in strategic discussions, and considered for opportunities they had never directly pursued. The reason was simple. Everyone wanted to work with someone who made them feel better about themselves and their ideas. The ripple effects were fascinating to observe. When someone felt truly heard and appreciated in a conversation with one of my successful students, they would often mention that person to others. "You should talk to Sarah about that. She really understands these issues." These unsolicited recommendations created a network effect that multiplied opportunities exponentially. But becoming a conversation magnet required more than just applying techniques. It demanded a fundamental shift in how you approached every human interaction. Instead of seeing conversations as transactions where you tried to get something from others, you began viewing them as opportunities to give something valuable: your full attention, genuine interest, and authentic appreciation. I learned that conversation magnets shared certain characteristics that made them irresistible to others. They were genuinely curious about people and ideas. They listened not just to respond, but to understand. They remembered details about others' lives and interests. They made people feel important and valued. Most importantly, they were more interested in being helpful than in being impressive. The energy of conversation magnets was distinctive. They brought enthusiasm to discussions without overwhelming others. They maintained optimism without seeming naive. They showed vulnerability without appearing weak. They demonstrated confidence without seeming arrogant. This balance of qualities created an atmosphere where others felt safe to share their real thoughts and feelings. But perhaps the most important quality was emotional generosity, the willingness to invest energy in helping others feel good about themselves and their ideas. This wasn't manipulation or flattery. It was a genuine commitment to adding value to every interaction. When someone left a conversation feeling energized and appreciated, they naturally wanted to experience that feeling again. The compound effects extended far beyond immediate conversations. People who had positive interactions with conversation magnets would remember them months or years later when opportunities arose. They became walking advertisements for the person who had made them feel valued and understood. I observed that conversation magnets also attracted higher quality relationships. When you consistently demonstrate genuine interest in others, you attract people who are themselves capable of meaningful connection. Superficial networkers and manipulative personalities were naturally filtered out, leaving relationships based on mutual respect and genuine care. The business implications were profound. Companies sought out these individuals for client-facing roles because customers felt comfortable and understood in their presence. Teams wanted them as leaders because they felt heard and valued under their guidance. Colleagues trusted them with sensitive information because they demonstrated genuine care for others' well-being. But the personal rewards were equally significant. Conversation magnets developed rich, fulfilling relationships that sustained them through challenges and amplified their joys. They built networks of people who genuinely cared about their success, not because of what they could provide, but because of how they made others feel. The key insight was that becoming a conversation magnet wasn't about perfecting techniques, it was about developing genuine care for other people's experiences, thoughts, and feelings. When that care became authentic and consistent, all the specific skills we had learned served its expression naturally and powerfully. The ultimate irony was that the more you focused on making others feel important and valued, the more important and valued you became in their eyes. By giving away attention, appreciation, and understanding generously, you received trust, respect, and opportunities in return from far beyond what you had given. My final teaching notes, written in the quiet of my study after decades of helping people transform their communication, contain what I believe are the most important truths about human connection. These aren't just techniques or strategies. They're principles that can change not only your conversations, but your entire life trajectory and the lives of everyone you encounter. The journey we've taken together, from that terrified farm boy who couldn't speak at his own graduation to someone who has helped millions find their voice, proves something fundamental about human potential. The ability to connect authentically with others isn't a gift reserved for the naturally charismatic. It's a skill that anyone can develop through commitment, practice, and genuine care for others. But with this power comes profound responsibility. When you master the art of conversation, when you can influence how people feel about themselves and their possibilities, you hold something precious in your hands. You can use these abilities to serve your own narrow interests, or you can use them to lift others, create positive change, and contribute to a world where people feel more understood and valued. I've watched students take these principles in both directions. Some used their improved communication skills primarily to advance their careers, close more sales, or gain personal advantage. While there's nothing inherently wrong with personal success, these individuals missed the deeper joy and fulfillment that comes from using your abilities to genuinely help others thrive. The students who found the greatest satisfaction and often the greatest success were those who saw their communication skills as a form of service. They used their ability to listen deeply to help colleagues solve problems. They used their appreciation skills to help team members recognize their own potential. They used their conversation mastery to build bridges between people who had previously misunderstood each other. The legacy you build through your conversations extends far beyond the immediate interactions. Every person you make feel truly heard and valued carries that experience with them. They're more likely to listen carefully to others, to show appreciation genuinely, to approach difficult conversations with empathy rather than defensiveness. The principles you embody become contagious, spreading through your network and beyond. Think about the conversations that have shaped your own life. The teacher who believed in you when you doubted yourself. The colleague who really listened when you were struggling. The friend who asked exactly the right questions to help you clarify your thinking. These people didn't just have good conversations with you, they demonstrated what human connection could look like at its best. Now you have the opportunity to be that person for others. Every conversation becomes a chance to make someone's day a little brighter, to help them feel a little more valued, to encourage them to share ideas they might otherwise keep to themselves. This isn't about being perfect or having all the answers. It's about bringing genuine care and attention to each human interaction. The future of your relationships, your career, and your impact in the world will be largely determined by the quality of your conversations. These daily interactions, often seeming small and insignificant in the moment, accumulate over time to create your reputation, your network, and your legacy. Your personal action plan starts today with your very next conversation. Will you listen with your full attention, or will you be distracted by your own thoughts? Will you look for something genuine to appreciate in the person you're talking with? Will you ask questions that invite them to share what matters to them? Will you make them feel important and valued? The choice is yours, and it's a choice you'll make thousands of times in the years ahead. Each conversation is an opportunity to practice these principles, to deepen your skills, and to contribute something positive to another person's experience. Remember that mastery isn't about perfection, it's about consistent commitment to growth and service. You'll have conversations that don't go well, moments when you fall back into old patterns, times when you miss opportunities to connect more deeply. That's part of the learning process. What matters is your commitment to keep improving, to keep caring, and to keep seeing each interaction as a chance to make a positive difference. The world needs people who can listen with empathy, communicate with authenticity, and build bridges across the differences that seem to divide us. You now have the tools to be one of those people. The question isn't whether you can master these skills, the question is whether you will choose to use them in service of something greater than yourself. Your conversation mastery journey begins now, with the person you'll speak with next. Make it count.